What you doing?
Nothing.
What's the red light on for?
No reason.
What's the red light?
I see.
He's got a red ear.
What day is it?
Christmas 2011. Merry Christmas to all.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, I say.
Thank you.
I like your outfit.
Thank you. I like yours too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, let me put my ankle bracelet on.
Fancy.
It's a little loose, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what the wrench was going to be for. I was going to fix that.
But can I get it on and off?
Well, the idea is I'll crank it on there and you'll just keep it on forever.
Keep it on forever?
Yep.
It's pretty permanent.
I mean, you can crank it off just as easily.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd be able to fly and go through the...
It's stainless steel, so I'm not exactly sure. I have surgical steel on my wrist, which...
It's a tiny bit. You got a little tiny piece.
Well, I also have it in my mouth. It adds up after a while.
It does that.
So, where were you born, grandmother?
I was born in Somerville, Massachusetts.
When?
On April 15th, 1923.
What was Somerville, Massachusetts like in 1923?
Well, I don't know. I can't remember.
How long did you live there?
Until I was married, until 1950 I left. That's when I got married, in 1950. But I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 4 years, and then I left Cambridge and went to Columbus, Ohio. In Cambridge, I had Carol was my first daughter.
Where is Cambridge, Ohio?
No, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. I thought you said Ohio in there.
Well, she said
Well,
she left Cambridge and went to Ohio.
I went to
Columbus,
Ohio.
where
I've got to tell
I'm
about
jumping ahead.
Yeah,
You're all jumping ahead. So you were born in Massachusetts, and you told me you didn't remember what it was like, but if you lived there...
Well,
20
You said, what was it like in 23, the year she was born? She was being literal. She doesn't remember it from
I
1922.
realized that.
Okay.
Okay, I
But-
grew up in Somerville,
Uh-huh.
and I lived in the family house that was the Wilson family house.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 3-story house. One of my mother's sisters lived downstairs on the first floor. And my grandmother...
That was who?
That was the Pierces. Harriet.
Those were relatives of yours?
This was my aunt. This was the Wilson family. My mother was a Wilson. And she married Frederick W. Crispin. My mother was Emily Laura Wilson.
Her sister Harriet.
And her sister Harriet was the oldest sister, and she lived downstairs. Harriet was married to Ernest Pierce, and they had 2 daughters, Constance and Marjorie. So, on the second floor, my grandmother Wilson lived. That was her house, but her husband had died, and she was living with her youngest daughter, Selena, who was unmarried. She was my mother's youngest sister. Also, there was a brother, Thomas, who was unmarried. He was living there. And this was during the Depression, so that would have been in the 39. That's when my mother and father came to live in the family house.
Does that family house still stand? Do you know?
It's still there.
Do you know who owns it these days?
No, it's been updated and gentrified for that area. That area of Somerville. It sort of went downhill, but then they gentrified it, just like they've done a lot of cities. Because it's near colleges, it's near Tufts College, it's near Harvard College, it's near Radcliffe College, MIT. It's just right in the college area.
When's the last time you were there?
I was there for one of the funerals of my cousins. It was Harry Volkmann's brother.
Donald?
And when was it?
Oh, I don't remember the year. No, it wasn't Donald. It was Kenneth.
Kenneth. So was it in the 90s or was it?
Oh, it must have been the 90s.
So did you still recognize it despite all the changes to the house in the area?
Oh, sure. It's been painted and so forth. But I recognize the neighborhood.
We'll talk about the third floor then. You and your parents moved in.
Yeah, and so my mother and father had to live in the attic, had us be in the attic bedroom, and Wilson and I were in the middle attic room. I remember he was in a big bed, and I was in a little cot. It was a huge attic, and it had trunks all around it for storage.
It didn't have bedrooms partitioned off.
Oh no.
It was an attic.
It was an unfinished attic. And my mother was in the front room, which was a bedroom. Mm-hmm. And then the back bedroom was where Uncle Tom lived. He was the bachelor uncle who I think maybe he was a little bit, what would we say? I don't know whether he was retarded. I think he became emotionally upset. He wasn't able to work long. Whoops.
So,
but he lived there.
If you lived in the attic with your bedrooms, where did you have your meals and cook?
Then we went downstairs to the second floor and ate with my grandmother and Aunt Slater and my mother and my father.
And did you use a living room down there?
Oh, sure. And
so you shared space, but you had your bedrooms up.
The bedrooms were upstairs, and there was a back stairway from Uncle Tom's bedroom down to the first floor. So he would go down that way, and he would eat with Harriet and Ernest. But sometimes he would get mad at them. Something crazy that he would be upset. So then he'd come upstairs and eat with us.
So you never knew which way the wind blew?
No, we never knew.
So everybody didn't eat together?
No, not this first floor. They had their own. Aunt Hattie and Ernie and Marjorie and Connie, they ate together. And then Tom sometimes ate with them. If he was mad at them, then he came upstairs to the second floor and ate with his mother and his sisters and my family. My father used to sort of make fun of Tom. He'd call him the lad.
The lad?
The lad.
Why did he call him that?
Well, he was I don't know, my father had quite a good sense of humor. Mm-hmm. Well, he was the son.
With all the sisters?
With all the sisters. He was the lad. I don't know what they call him the lad. My father, when I look back and see how hard it must have been for him to come and live in that family with everybody, he would spend the evenings down in the basement. He had his own library down there, and he had a little workshop. He was an engineer, a civil engineer. He had a job during the day, but in the evening, the only thing you could do was listen to the radio, and we would always listen to, I forget who it was, the newsman. I'll think of it in a minute. But then we always listened to Amos and Andy. He came on after the news. Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas was the newsman.
So who was this again that had the civil engineering job?
My father,
Is that how
Frederick W. Christian.
is that how the family got through the Depression?
Well, during the Depression, he lost his job
I'm sure.
before he was, after we came to live to the big house.
Mm-hmm.
He had a cousin down. My mother had a cousin in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
So we went down to Atlanta and lived for 2 years. 2 or 3 years. I have pictures of me being down in Atlanta.
How old were you at the time?
I was 4 when we came back to Boston.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
very young.
But I can remember one thing. We lived on Lawton Street, and it was sort of a main drag. And I remember watching the Chain Gang.
Wow.
They wore black and white suits, and they were chained together, and they would come down that street. Well, that's really the only thing I can remember. That must have made an impression on me.
Can you remember if they were black
Oh, they
or
were
white?
black. Of course they were black.
Really?
Everybody?
They weren't.
Oh, they're black.
You didn't see any white prisoners?
I'm sure I didn't.
So was that because the prisons were segregated, or because there were more
Because-
black people imprisoned in Atlanta? Why do you think that
Well,
was?
it's probably,
Combination.
they were very conscious of the black.
Yeah.
It wasn't until after Martin Luther King that they became liberalized.
So was this in the 30s then?
Yeah,
Okay.
because let's see, if I was
Atlanta.
I was
in the
born in
30s.
23.
I guess it was late 20s.
Late
then.
The late
20s.
20s.
So you were in the height of Jim Crow
Yeah,
down
sure.
in the Deep South.
Yeah.
So that's all that was in the prisons with the blacks.
And what were the chain gangs doing? Were they labor
Well, they
chain
were
gangs?
like it was the end of work. They'd been probably working on roads or something.
Mhm.
But I just remember seeing them marching down the
Yeah,
street.
at that era of Jim Crow, they were
Well, they would have them out working, and then they'd take them back to the prison.
almost like indentured servants in the prisons. They were
Yeah,
rounded up for
Slave
vagrancy,
labor,
and exactly, the prison system used them for slave labor. It was a kind of a conscription that was just a step above slavery, or the sharecropper kind of work they could get in the area.
Doesn't that still kind of happen today? Albeit less racially biased.
sure. We haven't really progressed much.
With the prison industrial system?
Yeah.
Well, the prison industrial complex has a huge, disproportionate number of African
I
Americans.
realize that.
So, but yeah, so it does still happen today. It's even worse today because of the laws they made.
Really? Worse today?
It is worse today. The drug laws they made have
Oh.
resulted in the 3 strikes and you're out drug laws made it very easy to
Put them in.
lock up
Yeah.
black folks for drug crimes that white folks get away with because of their method of imbibing the drugs.
Yeah.
The street drugs
Yeah, it
have
could just
harsher
be-
penalties than the Wall
Designer
Street folks.
drugs.
Yeah, design with their sniffing coke off toaster ovens kind of stuff.
Haven't heard of that one before.
Oh, it's a famous one in one of the.
Really?
It's a story for one of the government agencies where they were busy sniffing coke off toaster ovens.
Huh.
Yeah.
Usually hear about like a prostitute's ass or something like that.
Mm.
I guess if you're a fat cat, you'll sniff it off of whatever you can find.
Yeah, there you go.
So you must have been about 3 at the time. And for this image to stick with you,
Yeah,
that must have
because
been really
I
striking.
know that when I was probably 4, because because when we came back to live in the. See, my father lost that job. He only was there a few.
What was he doing there again?
Oh, he was doing a civil engineering job
Okay.
with a company in Atlanta who was a cousin of my mother's. You know, families took care of families. So Wilson, my brother, who was 6 years older than I, started school there. But I didn't because I was too young.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't start kindergarten until we came back to Somerville.
And when you came back to Somerville, did you live in the same house?
I lived in the family house, the Wilson house, which was sort of like the Depression house of all the
Yeah.
family together.
Sounds like.
That's how they did it.
How many people were living in the house? It sounded like a lot.
4,
How many
5,
families?
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
11 people in this 3-story house.
And what you have to know about the attic is it was unheated in the winter and it was uncooled in the
Right,
summertime.
that's true. It
Yeah.
was very cold, and I used to have a hot water bag to warm the bed up at night, and wear flannel.
Mm-hmm.
No bathroom up there, was there?
Oh no! And my uncle, rather than to get up at night, we used to call him Jimmy Pots,
Mm-hmm.
crockery, and had a little lid on it. And every morning he'd see him take his little pot downstairs to the first floor, to Hattie's house. He got along good with Hattie, but he didn't get along with Ernie. Ernie?
Do you know why?
Huh?
Do you know why? Personality clashes or?
Oh, Ernie was a hard person to get along with. I couldn't stand him either.
So who was Ernie again? What was the relation?
Ernie was Hattie's husband.
And who was Hattie?
Hattie was the oldest daughter. She lived Harriet.
The oldest Wilson then?
Yes,
Okay.
Her mother's, this is one of her mother's
my
oldest
mother's
sisters.
oldest sister.
Okay.
And
So,
she wasn't as pretty as the other girls. She married Ernie, who he worked in Squire's Meat Company. So he wasn't a professional. No, the only one that was half professional was my father, who learned how to be an engineer by Hard Knocks.
mhm.
He took a correspondence course in engineering, and then he got to during World War. Before they moved to Somerville, it was in World War One.
Yeah.
He did sewer work, and then he did architectural work. But you know,
So he basically got into it through experiences, is what I'm hearing, rather than going to school.
oh no, he couldn't afford to go to MIT,
Mhm.
but they would still hire him
Because he had,
because
like,
he
the
knew how to do
experience.
it.
Yeah.
And he built bridges and buildings later on, and here he wasn't even an MIT architecture graduate, but you have to hand it to him. He
Oh, hell yeah.
he was quite a, I guess you'd call him an entrepreneur.
An American, one of those bootstrappy Americans.
Right.
So,
His family was interesting too.
what
That's
was his
another
life
long
like?
story.
That's okay, we have time. What was his life like? You said, did he serve in the war, or?
No,
World
he
War
didn't
One?
serve in it. He just worked in the sewers. Wilson, my brother Wilson, knew more about his war experiences because he told him, and it may be in his tape that he mentions more about what our father did. Because see, my father was a very quiet Bostonian. He wouldn't sit down and chat, really. If ever I asked him something, he'd say, "Ask your mother."
Well, he had a handicapping condition that kept him out of the military, didn't he?
Well, yes, he had one leg shorter than the other.
How
But
much
that-
so, do you know?
But that didn't show up until he was older.
So when he was draft age or military age, that would not have been a factor?
Probably not.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how old he was then.
Well,
When was he born?
I'd have to look that up.
Yeah.
we have it in a chart, her
Yeah.
genealogy chart, we have it. So when, did he had an accident off
Well,
a
he
horse?
he fell off the horse or he was dragged off.
Oh, wow.
He grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, down by the ocean. And his father came over from England
Mm-hmm.
and was a house builder.
So
I
he was
guess-
first generation American then, I guess?
He was second year.
My father, yeah, because I imagine Andrew Hingston became an American citizen. His name was Andrew Hingston Crispin. They had 11 children.
Wow. Big family.
I know. And my father's, one of his sisters was Elsie Waldman, whose son is Harry Waldman, who we have the book about him being a meteorologist in Chicago area. And I'm getting mixed up in the Crispin family and the Wilson family. And
Well, there were a lot of you living in that house.
that's true.
Sounds like there was a lot of mixing up at the time. And I mean, if it was the Great Depression, that was going on all around the
Well,
country.
her family was in one big family, multi-generational house.
Yes.
Harry Volkman's family was a
In
few blocks
another
away in another 3-story multi-generational family
Right.
house. So
That's how
that
they
was
did it.
typical.
So what was it like growing up in a multi-generational house? Do you think that,
Well, I always felt like I had everybody bossing me.
so that was a frustrating thing?
Well, as a little girl,
I mean, if you have a whole lot of moms and dads, I can understand how that
well,
can be
that's the way it
frustrating.
was, I felt.
Yeah.
And Wilson was 6 years older than me,
hmm
so I was just a little sister.
Did he get preferential treatment because of his age and his
Well,
masculinity?
he probably did. I don't remember doing it. My mother was not too active. She was sort of a
homebody?
homebody, and she just never, I don't think she ever worked.
Ever?
I don't think so.
Was that common for women?
Right.
To just
They
get
got-
their MRS degree, as we
That's
say
right.
these days?
Her youngest sister, Selena,
Mm-hmm.
as all the kids called her, she became a teacher. She
Mhm.
went to, they called it normal school.
Right, that's what you
What's-
she went
teaching school.
She,
Okay, teaching
yeah, she
school.
went to teaching school.
Berea had a normal school at one point.
There's a normal town in Athens. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
I doubt there's a connection. But
So she went to Leslie, which was in Cambridge. And she
who was
taught-
this again? Who went to Leslie?
This is Aunt Selena.
Okay. And that what was her relation to you? Your sister, I guess.
Her
No,
aunt.
she was
Oh,
my,
I'm
her
sorry.
mother's sister.
I thought she
Yes.
was my mother's aunt.
No. She
No,
was
no.
my great aunt.
Okay.
yeah, and my kids all loved her because she was able to travel and the kids were, my kids were born. She saw all my family.
Sounds like quite a lifestyle. So she
taught first grade for 40 years.
and that's how she achieved this lifestyle
Yeah,
by
she-
hard
She was a
work.
professional.
Yeah, she never married. I don't know whether she was a lesbian or not. In those days, he never talked about it, but she never got married. Maybe she felt the responsibility of taking care of her mother.
How uncommon was it for a woman not to get married and to be a career woman in those days?
Well, usually they had a reason, like I think she was taking care of her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And or there would be someone in the family that they were taking care of. Because in my father's family, there was one of the sisters who had polio at an early age and wasn't able to walk. Her legs were,
Crippled.
crippled. And so the other sister took care of her, Aunt Ethel. So Jessie and G, we called her G, and they were not married, and they took care of them. And then the oldest sister, Elsie, was the one who was a nurse in World War II, and that's when she met a German man.
Wow. How did that happen?
Well, he was a German, but he was an American. His name was Volkmann.
So he was fighting for the Allies then?
I guess so, yeah. There's more about his family that Harry will tell you about.
Okay.
And so she had 4 boys, and he had died, not in the war, but afterwards. Or maybe he died in the war, I can't remember. So here she was, a young woman with 4 boys, so she came home to the Crispin house. So that was the one that lived.
Was that your house? That was the one a
wasn't
couple
my
of blocks
house.
away.
That was,
Yours was the Wilson house, correct?
yeah. This was the Crispin house, which was about 3 streets over from the Wilson house.
So if she was a nurse in the military, was she trained by the military, or did she go to?
Oh, she probably went to nursing school.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's 2 sisters that were educated.
Yeah,
Selena
and Elsie.
Elsie. Is that the oldest and youngest?
Yeah, because none of the other
Elsie was the
none
oldest.
of the other Crispin girls had jobs like that.
They didn't have the education. So it
No.
was unusual in your generation for both men and women to go to. Well,
oh, right.
Yeah, it was fairly uncommon to go to college, wasn't it?
Yeah,
but
because my father's family, I guess, he
your
probably,
parents' generation, but your generation, so a lot of your
they all
cousins
did.
and your
Yeah.
brother, you and your brother and your cousins all went to college.
Right,
But your parents' generation, it was less common to be college educated at that point.
right.
Although you did have some in your family who were. Selena and Elsie.
Right.
So they
And
were
then,
your parents' generation.
My father, as he said, he went to the College of Hard Knocks. His was like a correspondence course. But he,
What is a correspondence course? I don't understand.
well, it's kind of like doing it on the internet. Wouldn't you call it nowadays? Through books, reading.
So it was
them.
kind of a distance education rather than being in a classroom.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
You
then
would mail in stuff.
probably have to take an exam to certify you.
Mm-hmm.
But my father
Interesting.
put his youngest brother, Russell, he was the youngest brother, he paid for him to go to college. And he went to Bowdoin College.
Bowdoin
That's where Ben's going.
in Maine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A guy I grew up with,
Oh,
a friend of mine, really good friend, is going to Bowdoin. He loves it.
That's
Uh-huh.
Ben.
oh Ben.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. I plan on visiting him there after I graduate, seeing what all the hubbub about Bowdoin is about. What did you hear about
Now
Bowdoin?
you know you have a family member that went there.
Oh, I don't know what I heard. I just know it was a name.
Mm-hmm.
So that was Russell. That
That was Russell, and,
And what was his relation to you again? Russell's?
well, he was my uncle.
Okay.
And he lived, he had worked for managing like a W.T. Grant, like a 5 and 10 store.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up owning the Crispin 5 and 10 store.
The Crispin
Yeah.
5 and 10.
Yes, in Shelby, Ohio. And after the war, this goes on and on. After the war,
the Second World War.
the Second World War, Wilson came out of the service as a lieutenant, I guess. and he was drafted, and he was looking for a job teaching. He wanted to teach, but none of the teaching jobs were paying as much as he had had as a lieutenant in the service. And he had 2 children by then, and so he needed a little more money than he could get teaching. Besides, there was nothing available. So Uncle Russell had the Crispin 5 and 10 store. He invited Wilson to come out to Shelby and to help run the store. Well, they took that job, and Muriel
Uncle Wilson's
was Uncle
wife.
Wilson's wife. It was hard for her to leave Boston and come out to a little town in Ohio. And it seemed that Uncle Russell's wife had been used to running the business in another store. And she was running the Shelby 5 and 10. She resented the fact that a young relative was coming to work. And Russell had said that Wilson would get into the business and be able to run it, but the wife had a different, she made it kind of miserable for them. So they stayed there for a few years, and then Wilson left Russell's job and got another job in Shelby. That's when he started to work as a salesman for Shelby Spring Hinge Company. So that's a hardware company. So he did that for quite a few years, and then they had a branch in California. So they took that up and that's when they moved to Garden Grove, California.
Outside of Los Angeles.
Yeah. And that was the Orange Grove country. I mean, that's when they were just beginning. There were a lot of orange groves at that time. Garden Grove became the town where the Crystal Cathedral popped up, and that became so famous on the TV. Wilson is my brother, and he lived there until the kids were through school, and then they moved out to
New Mexico?
New Mexico.
Rio Rancho?
Rio Rancho, New Mexico, where after he had retired, and they needed another place to live. And he stayed there until they moved till Muriel died, and then Wilson went to live with his son in Oregon. And he was the ranger.
Doug.
Doug Chrisman. But Wilson lived to be 90 years old, and he was quite a fascinating person, and I always adored him as my big brother.
So how old are you now, if you don't mind
I'm
me asking?
88. I have a few more years to live to be 90.
Getting close.
Getting close.
So you were born in Massachusetts, and you lived there for a couple of years during the Great Depression in the family house. You moved down to Atlanta when things got rough, but moved back shortly thereafter.
When you were born,
Oh,
did
yeah.
you live in the family house?
Oh no, I lived, I forget where, I don't know where we lived.
Your parents had their
We
own
lived in
place?
Somerville somewhere.
They had their own
Yeah,
house
they had their own house.
before
before they moved into the, wasn't until after the Depression, during the Depression, that we moved into the big house.
Okay.
So, because we went down to Atlanta, and then we came back and lived in that big house. And then...
And what were you doing at the time? You were growing up, obviously.
I was growing up. I started kindergarten, and I went to school.
Did you go to the school that your Aunt Selena taught in?
Yes, I did, but I didn't have her.
How come?
Because I didn't want to have my aunt. I had my aunt every day.
Got enough teaching outside of the classroom?
Well, you know, you just didn't do that in those days. You didn't.
Yeah. Did you see her
I had
around?
Miss Octavia. Octavia Stewart, I think her name was.
Did you see Selena around in the halls?
Oh, yes, we'd go to school together.
Nice.
Yeah. They probably all knew that she was my aunt, but...
I'd imagine they would.
But that was just the elementary school, and then I went to another school.
Did they have middle school and high school
Well,
broken out
then we had this was just a kindergarten.
Oh, I see.
Then we went to another school. It was up to 4th, 5th grade, I guess. Then we had the junior high, then we had the high school. And then I went to college for 2 years.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Maryville College. Maryville,
Where is
Tennessee.
In Tennessee. So you lived in Massachusetts up until you moved away for college?
Mm-hmm. And I was there for 2 years, and then my father lost his job again. And he was getting older. And in those days, they believed that the boy should have the education that the girl doesn't really need an education. And my brother had gone to Harvard. So I had that to contend with. Here, my brother was in Harvard, he was getting a scholarship, and I felt like I wasn't smart enough to get a scholarship like he was. And I decided I didn't want to go to the colleges that were all around in Boston. And we found this college in Tennessee that was reasonable. It was a church-related college. It was a Presbyterian college. And Wilson had a friend whose brother had gone there. So we sent away for the catalog, and we could afford it. It was cheap. But I only went 2 years because my father was out of a job, and he decided they couldn't afford it. And my aunt, Selena, who was still teaching, she offered to loan the money. But in those days, my mother didn't even have a charge account. They didn't believe in borrowing. And if they didn't have the money, they didn't do it. So I was foolish enough not to have taken up my aunt's offer to borrow money and go back to school and finish.
Do you think that was at the behest of your parents? Do you think they swayed your
decision? Well, it was
decision?
just the way we were brought up.
Yeah.
They didn't push education as much as some of the other families did.
So what made you decide to go to college to begin with, then?
Why did I?
If
Well,
it wasn't
my
very
brother
common.
was going to college. I always wanted to go to college. And I thought, well, it would be neat to go get away.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
I had been, bossed by all these people all my life. I wanted to get away.
So
I had a little bit of independence.
how many of your other female friends went to college?
Oh, a lot of them just went around to Harvard, to Radcliffe,
The
Tufts,
local schools.
the local schools.
Okay.
Of your female friends, your male
my-
cousins all went to all those schools too, except for the
Yeah.
Radcliffe, the women's school. You had cousins in Tufts and MIT
Yeah.
and Harvard. Your brother in Harvard.
Mm-hmm. And I had other cousins at Harvard too.
So what did you study in college?
So I wanted to be a dietitian. So I was taking dietetics. And,
What inspired you to study dietetics?
Oh, I always loved to mess around the kitchen. I
Me
thought
too.
that was something I wanted to do.
And how did you enjoy studying it?
Well, I didn't really get into
The meat and potatoes, so
Yeah.
to speak?
That's true. You had to take the basics. Like I remember, I hated chemistry, and you had to take the same chemistry that the med students took,
Yeah,
and that was hard.
definitely.
I couldn't take that.
What did you think about chemistry when you studied it, Mom?
Chemistry was tough for me because I didn't take it in high school. I took it in college, and as you know, my college education was completed in my late 40s, early 50s. So by the time I was taking my first chemistry class, I was probably 50 years old, and it was my most difficult class I took, and that was the one class that I got a C in my whole college academic career.
Was that similar to your experience, Grandmother?
Had you had chemistry in high school before you took it? In college?
Probably basic stuff.
I had not had it because I had taken zoology in high school instead of chemistry. So
And why did you take zoology in high school?
why did I take zoology in high school? I liked biology, and I thought, well, there was a choice between chemistry or zoology, and everybody was taking the chemistry class because there was a young hippie teacher, and I thought, well, I'm going to be different. I'm going to take the zoology class,
She wanted to cut up a frog.
and I liked it. So
Do you think chemistry was easier for you than, Grandmother? Because you had some exposure to it? I mean, you said it wasn't your favorite class in the whole wide world, but
Well, it was hard. I can't remember whether I passed.
I think it's hard for everybody.
Yeah. So then that was just the 2 years, and then after that, my father said they didn't have the money to send me back.
So what else did you study in those 2 years? You were doing pre-dietetics, doing
Oh.
core stuff, I assume. You took chemistry.
Oh yeah, and it was a Presbyterian school, and you had to take Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember studying Paul's missionary journals and journeys and English and so forth.
Any history
I
in
never
there?
was too. Well, I can't remember. I must have had history, yeah. But I never was too fascinated by the other subjects. I was just waiting for
The good stuff.
the good stuff.
Yeah.
and did you take a
I'm
foreign,
still waiting for the good stuff, and I'm almost done with my degree.
Did you take a foreign language in college?
Yeah, I took French, and Daddy always said after we were married that I taught French with a Boston accent.
I was told that I speak Chinese with a French accent, so
Oh, really?
Yeah. guess it happens.
Yeah, I guess so. So then I came home and I had to do something. So I got a job at Liberty Mutual Insurance Company.
Wow, what were you doing with them?
I was called what was it? It was like a file.
Kind of a clerk type
Clerk
position,
stuff, yeah.
office work.
Right. Oh, the actuarial department.
Wow.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, it does.
And I remember using a adding machine and having to. In those days, you had cards that they were all filed. Now it's all on the computer. But I worked there for until we got married. In the meantime, I went to the youth program at our church, and
This was after college?
no. This was after I stopped college.
Mhm.
I was a member of the College Avenue Methodist Church in Somerville, Massachusetts, and the youth program in that church these were all the kids you'd grown up with, and somehow or other you looked down on them.
Because they hadn't gotten out.
Because you knew them as,
You knew all their dirty secrets.
fresh kids in school and stuff. And Wilson then was the Harvard student. And he went to the Wesley Foundation at Harvard Epworth, because that's where since he was a Harvard student, he went to that church, and they had a great youth program, and it was called the Wesley Foundation. And he met this beautiful blonde, and he ended up marrying her. So when I, was after I dropped out of college, he said, "Why don't you go to the foundation?" So rather than go to my own church youth program, I went over to Harvard Epworth. But I wasn't the only one in my church. A lot of the other girls went over because...
Is that for the sake of meeting people?
Sure.
So is that how most
people met? A lot
people
of the people that were at this program
were attractive?
were ROTC from the Navy.
So they were attractive.
Yeah, and there were chaplains, and there were also students from MIT and Harvard. And
so this is where all the keepers hung out, right?
sure, all the action, all the good guys were.
Mm-hmm. All the keepers.
So we all, as they said, College Avenue girls all went over to Harvard Epworth to nag a husband. That's what my husband says.
And is that where you met your husband?
That's where I met him, because he came in as the assistant director
Oh, wow.
of students. And at that time, I was on the board. I was secretary. And
Were you still in actuarial at the time?
Oh, I think I was, yeah. I was still in the actuarial department. Looking for a...
Looking for a hubby there as well?
Yeah. Oh, no, not there. That was just
money?
factory work, it seemed like,
Yeah.
compared to what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I was inspired by the program there, and I became active in social action. And
So what was the denomination of this program?
Methodist, United Methodist.
Okay. So you mentioned that you went to a Presbyterian college.
Oh, I know. That sort of bothered me.
Why did it bother you?
Well, they had a sort of a, what do they call it? It was a February program every year. It was kind of like a revival. And I wasn't into revivals.
Yeah. So what was your faith like growing up then?
Well, it's just, I just went along with the Methodists, and
Were your folks Methodist?
oh yes,
Okay.
everybody was Methodist.
So you were raised
Except
Methodist?
my father. My father said he was baptized an Episcopalian.
Mm-hmm.
And so his family had gone to the Episcopal Church. But he would not come to Methodist Church with us unless Wilson and I were singing in the choir or doing something. He would come with Mother.
Why do you think that was? Did he not enjoy the message?
Well, I think he was just a stubborn Episcopalian.
Yeah.
He would come with our mother.
But he didn't go off to the Episcopal Church himself.
Oh no, he wouldn't go. Because see, we didn't have a car.
How'd you get around?
Streetcar.
Okay.
Walk to church. Take the bus. So
So you were raised Methodist, and for some crazy reason you decided to go to Presbyterian college.
just because it was cheap.
Yeah, because it was a good deal.
Yeah.
But when you came back, you got more involved with the Methodists, and
Well,
that's...
then I got back into the Methodist thing, and then what did I do? Oh, when I was down in Maryville, there were all guys studying to be Presbyterian ministers,
Mhm.
and I didn't want to be involved with a minister. So what did I do?
got involved with the
Got back
minister.
home and got involved with the minister.
Yeah,
But he was a Methodist
but
minister,
he was a
so
Methodist. Yeah, he
Teach-
was different.
teach me about the difference between Presbyterians and Methodists. I don't know much about either denomination?
Well, the Methodists are more social,
Socially liberal,
Socially,
would you say?
yeah.
Socially active?
because John Wesley would go out to the. He was raised an Episcopalian,
Uh-huh.
and his father was Episcopalian priest, and they were preaching to the workers in the like steel workers or iron
And the
workers.
coal miners.
What
Coal
time was
miners.
this?
Huh?
What time period was this?
Oh,
Late 1800s, early 1900s?
Well,
must have been the 80s.
John Wesley came to Georgia, and when we went to
Savannah.
Fort Scriven, the fort on the way out to Tybee.
Yeah.
There's a marker for John Wesley's where he first came to
I remember
Georgia, and he was in Savannah for a while. So it was pre-Civil War.
Yeah,
that. Wow.
he
Yeah.
came to convert the Indians or whoever was in Savannah.
So, how long did he stick with that evangelical mission, converting the Indians?
Oh, well, that was his whole mission. He didn't stay in America too long. I think he got a little,
Jaded, maybe?
no, I can't remember the whole reason.
So he came to preach to the Indians, but you mentioned that he was preaching to the workers and the American proletariat,
Right,
it sounded like?
back in England when he was doing that.
There were. He wasn't just coming to the Indians in Georgia
no.
at that time.
He just wanted, it was the
The working folks of
yeah,
United States, America.
So these were the Methodists. They were based on Wesley and his teachings, his
Right.
social activism.
uh-huh.
And what about the Presbyterians? What are they
Well,
like?
the Presbyterians.
What are they all about?
I'm not so sure. Aren't they predestination? Isn't that their? I think that's their. Calvinist.
I'd have to do some.
I would
reading.
have to
don't know.
look it up to see what the difference is between the Presbyterians.
You mean they didn't make you memorize that in those 2 years at college?
Oh, I might have had to. But
Yeah, didn't stick with you. Didn't use it very
a lot of
often.
things didn't stick with me. When you get to be 88, a lot unsticks. I could look it up. So,
So you came back from Presbyterian land and you got involved with the Methodists, and that's where you met your husband.
that's where I met my husband, and he was going to be, and I didn't, when I was at Maryville, I had a couple of friends that were going to be Presbyterian ministers, but as
Were
I
these
said,
special friends?
oh yeah, oh, 2 or 3 of them. But I even went to see one of them in Philadelphia.
Wow, must have been a very special
Well, it was
friend.
on the way home from Boston. I stopped off to see him.
Ah, I see.
But I think he was gay now.
Huh.
I do.
Maybe so.
I didn't know much about gays then until after being in the campus ministry and Paul having to counsel them.
Did anybody know much about gays? What was the social climate like around homosexuality at the time?
Well, it was sort of hush-hush, if it was any. I mean,
Was it sort of hush hush or was it very hush hush?
oh, very hush-hush. You didn't talk about it. And then it was made fun of. It was...
So
wasn't accepted.
who was the first gay person you ever met?
Well, I
I
don't
mean-
think I can say because,
A lot of people hit
I
it.
don't know.
Yeah, open.
Yeah, probably not until we got to Purdue and Paul started counseling.
Students.
That's when he sort of came across it. He'd have fellows come and tell him, that they discovered that they were gay, and he had to talk to them. And one of them tried to kill himself and stuff like that.
So it was a tough time to be gay in America.
It was tough. I mean, so then that's when he decided, you better do more studying about it. And he started reading up.
So how integrated was the North at this point?
How was he what?
How integrated was the North? You mentioned
Racially.
you mentioned being really struck by the all-black chain gangs in Atlanta, but this was years later. You had grown up a lot. Were there a lot of black people in your communities in the North?
In Maryville.
That was college, correct?
Yes, and that was still Appalachians living in the hills. I can remember on Sunday afternoon we'd go for a walk and see some of these shacks where the people lived.
Nothing like mountain people.
The mountain people, whatever you call them.
Nothing else like them.
So that was kind of a shock to me.
Was there a black community in Maryville?
No, there weren't too many.
And were there any black people studying at the college with you?
There were a few international students, but I don't remember.
Do you know where they came from?
No.
Interesting.
Because I wasn't too involved. I didn't have any way to go out from the campus. I had no car.
Uh-huh.
And I wasn't, if I wanted to go to the church, I went a few times by walking down to the church.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't become involved. I remember I went to the Methodist church, and it wasn't like the Northern Methodist. It was like...
How so? How is it different?
Oh, it was too conservative.
Really?
I could see the difference.
And this was Maryville, Tennessee, was
Yeah.
it? Okay.
Oh, yeah, it was just like going to Berea.
It's in the Smokies.
What do you mean going to Berea? Is Berea more conservative? Is that what you're saying?
Well, when Berea Methodist Church became more conservative, that's when your family left and went to Union Church.
Yeah. Wasn't around for that, but I remember hearing talk of it.
You weren't around?
No, that was Jacob.
Oh.
I was perhaps not even a twinkle in my dad's eye, as they say.
Oh, you were plenty of twinkles there.
Did he have a lot of twinkles in his eye?
He had a lot of twinkles. That's right, there was so many years difference.
So, there were no black people at your college. Well, there were international students.
There are a few, but I don't remember. I
And
was just more involved in living in the dorm with trying to make it from a girl from Boston away.
trying to survive in Tennessee, of all places.
Right. Why did I come here?
Did you stick out like a sore thumb?
Oh, I felt like I did.
Were there many other Northerners, or were you pretty
Oh, a
rare
few.
breed?
There were a few.
Did you guys stick
But
together?
I had some friends that were. I remember this girl from Pennsylvania. I had a roommate from New York. She didn't last. She had a boyfriend that
Convinced her school wasn't in her best interest? Is that what happened?
well, do I think that was a good school to go to?
No. You mentioned you had a friend who had a boyfriend, and you
Oh, yeah,
implied
well,
that she
her-
didn't stick around for long.
Well, her boyfriend was in New York, and she stayed home with him. I guess they ran out of money too. See, that was right. 41, 42. That was the beginning of the war.
Mm-hmm. So
So-
people were still having a lot of money troubles at the time, even
Oh,
though
sure.
the economy was picking up with war production.
That was when I can remember Pearl Harbor starting, and I had just come home from a practice for the Messiah for the choir
Oh wow.
Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when we heard that
Pearl Harbor had
Japanese
been
had
attacked.
bombed Pearl Harbor.
So, did Pearl Harbor happen on a Sunday then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
December
then guess
7th.
what happened a few years later?
Many few
Many
years.
great things happened.
Noam Chomsky was born a couple of years later, and then even
Kirk
later,
And
Stopenhagen.
Kurt
Yep.
Stopenhagen.
even later, Kirk was, and then eventually, I came around.
Eventually, yes.
So how about the racial makeup of Somerville, Massachusetts? Was it a
Well-
white working class neighborhood where you grew up?
Mostly there were Italians, there were blacks.
Did the
There were
Italians
areas.
fit in? Did they keep to themselves?
Oh yeah, Boston was very segregated. Like there was the Irish stuff.
I was gonna say, what weren't the Irish people very big in Boston?
Oh sure, that's where we called them the lace curtain Irish. That's where the Kennedys came from.
Were the Kennedys lace curtain Irish?
Oh sure.
But you weren't-
What does that
you weren't-
mean,
Well,
lace
I
curtain?
wasn't right in Boston. I was in Somerville, which was like a suburb of Boston.
So
Somerville and Cambridge and Arlington and Medford, those were all just like Cincinnati and Price Hill and all the little burgs around it.
So
So-
how was it racially? How was Somerville?
Well, Somerville was mixed. There was Italian section and West Somerville, where we lived, that was sort of a suburban area.
What was the
Yeah.
racial makeup? When you went to school, did you go to school with Italians and Irish and English and blacks? Or
Whoever lived in that neighborhood, there weren't many. There were a few Italians mixed in, and
So the schools weren't necessarily explicitly segregated
oh no,
in that people in a neighborhood would go to a school, but because neighborhoods were segregated to a degree, the schools
well,
were kind
they
of...
maybe in Boston area, more or less, there was like the Italian district,
Yeah.
but it's where they lived. If you lived within the location, that's where the schools were.
So they lived
They didn't
together,
have
went to
any of
school
this.
together.
Busing and stuff. That didn't happen until later.
So how did you feel
But
about...
I went to Somerville High School. Was a big high school. There were
How big?
3,000 students there.
Wow, that is
There
big.
were 1,000 students when I graduated.
Wow.
So that was a big high school.
Mm-hmm. So how did you feel about non-American white people? Did you feel like there was a cultural
Oh,
difference, or did
I
you
loved
fit in?
going to the Wesley Foundation and meeting some of the foreign students.
Mhm.
And then also during the war, I was a USO girl, and I loved a group of the girls from the church went into an Episcopal church that had a program that provided dances for the,
Provided dances,
yeah, like on a Saturday night for
like
the,
lap dances.
no, you would have
Proper dances.
proper kinds of dances. Yes.
He's
Not
pushing
pole
you.
dancing, no pole dancing. We never heard of that. That's when I'd like to dance, seeing if the French sailors
sing.
would come, or the British sailors. No,
So they were just performances on the weekends.
yeah, you just go in and they would play records and you'd go and dance. And they weren't supposed to take you home. You were just supposed to dance with them.
Mm-hmm. So what does USO stand for? I've seen the symbol.
United Service Organization.
And is it mostly women, or is it...
Oh, sure, women will. They provided entertainment for the servicemen,
Mhm.
but I only did that for a couple of years.
So that was during the war. And had you met Paul by that point?
No, I was going to the Wesley Foundation, but then some of the foreign students were taking courses at Harvard, like part-time courses. And if any of them were interested to come to a Sunday program, a religious, program where you would have a speaker and discussion and a supper,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they would just come for the free supper. So,
Is it okay if we pause for a moment? I think
Sure.
my camera's doing something.